My name is Herb. I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to our Big Book 12-step workshop on Zoom. Please join me in the set-aside prayer, a prayer for intervention to open our minds and hearts. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the Serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. We've started this work in earnest now, taking a look at the reason for the work, the actual bullseye target reason. So we look at step 12, the very first phrase, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. That may have not been your primary reason in your consciousness, but now I hope it is. Spiritual awakening, that's the mission here. It won't happen by next week or even next month necessarily, but it will happen by the time you finish the 9th step. That's the guarantee in the Big Book. I don't use my terms loosely, guarantee. Read pages 84 and 85 again, as you will be reading for next week. It's the place where Bill tells us we enter the world of the spirit, and we've been placed in a position of neutrality, aka we've had a spiritual awakening which has relieved us and given us freedom from our addiction. It's a guarantee right there. But the continuation of the awakening isn't guaranteed. It says we're not cured. We have a daily reprieve. A daily reprieve on using step 10. Again, that's the assignment for next week. I'll be more formal about it in a minute. And step 11, which we will talk about today. So we literally have gone backwards for just a little bit in the step process, only so that we can grasp the mission, the value proposition, spiritual awakening, and understand what that means, and really have it as the carrot that draws us forward. There will be times when this is a real struggle, when it's really difficult to do, when it's painful even. And if you can have the vision of that carrot, that motive, that value, that mission, oh yeah, I'm willing to go through some short-term pain for the long-term gain. It's very countercultural for addicts. We want short-term gain, and we will submit to long-term pain if thinking in our delusion that we can delay that. And we're here because we didn't and couldn't. And then we take a look at step 11 as the primary tool of improved consciousness. Isn't that what's right in the step itself? That's the mission of step 11, to improve our conscious contact with power. And then next week, step 10, we'll take a look at the Big Book instructions on that tool, quite frankly, for emotional sobriety. It assumes that you've done the first 9 steps. We're kind of short-circuiting that, being kind of innovative and creative by taking on the tools of meditation and inventory. Daily, spot check inventory, so that we can stay as clean and as filled with the Spirit while we're looking at our journey in step one. That's the whole point of this approach to the step process. I was 4 years sober when I did this work. I had completed my first 8 steps. I was beginning to work on my 9th step, making the amends, and the man followed the directions in the big book, which says, commence this way of living as we clean up the past. We commence this way of living 10, 11, and 12 as we do step 9. So as I began to do step 9, he gave me instructions on 10, then the instructions on 11, and then the instructions on 12. Because he knew that doing step 9 required as much power as possible, and therefore we engage in those tools of power. When we came to step 11, he asked me to do what I asked you to do. And that is look up the term meditation in a dictionary. Many of you have a meditation practice. You may not call it that. You might call it quiet time. You might call it prayer time. You might call it contemplation time. You might call it mindfulness time. You might call it spiritual time. It doesn't matter what you call it. Many people, even in long-term in a 12-step fellowship, are very confused and or very ignorant about, and I don't mean that to be negative or dismissive, I just mean they don't know. And they don't know that they don't know. That's what I mean by ignorance. What the true meaning is of meditation, as it's in the Webster's Dictionary, as it's intended in the big book. Bill Wilson was a member of the Oxford group. He didn't have any religious training at all. No actual spiritual training. His grandfather, his mother's father, who raised him from about 12 or 13 years old, had some general spiritual leanings, but really didn't have much time for organized religion or any tradition like that. And Bill basically assimilated that attitude. But when he was dealing with his alcoholism, he went to the Oxford group because his friend Ebby got sober there. And Ebby was as bad a drunk as Bill. And if Ebby can get sober, Bill will get sober. Oh, it's a Christian organization? Oh, well, I can deal with that, he says. And it was a organization that was trying to recreate first century Christianity. What they did was they prayed Christian prayers. They read the Bible, the Christian Bible. They sat and they thought about what they read. They actually kept a notebook next to them and a pen. And they wrote down any ideas that they thought were guidance or inspirations, meaning movements of the Spirit, conversations with God. And then if they were in a group, they shared them with one another. Or when they went to their groups, their group meetings, the Oxford group meetings, they shared what guidance they got so that they could use the other members of the community as the sounding board for their guidance to see maybe if it was objective and from God, or it was not, it was totally subjective and from their ego or from their distortion of reality. That background is really important because step 11 in the big book was written based on that experience. When Bill met Bob, Bob was already in, Bob Smith, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, he was already in the Oxford group 2.5 years. He had been going to weekly meetings and getting drunk after every meeting. Because he thought it was a moral issue, a willpower issue, a knowledge issue. And then when Bill talked to him about alcohol and his experience with powerlessness of the body, the allergy, which he learned from Silkworth, powerless of the mind, as an obsession, which he learned from Silkworth, and explained his own experience of not being able to stop when he started and not being able to stay stopped when he did stop. And he was Bill was a man of extraordinary willpower in many areas, but not with alcohol. Bob was finally able to relate to the vocabulary and the experience, and then began to take his Oxford group teachings seriously. And of course, as you know, got sober and stayed sober until he died in 1950. Bill stayed in Bob's house beginning in June, all of July, all of August of 1935. And when they were there, Anne, Bob's wife, would hold court in the morning. She was a major Oxford group member, and she would teach what she called the boys meditation. That's where Bill got his ideas and his experience of meditation, which he now translates into the big book. So this man had me look up the term meditation in a dictionary. I hope you did that. We'll talk about it. My dictionary said directed thinking. I had also been given the instructions of reading and highlighting pages 85 to 88, and rereading it and highlighting it a second time, and then rereading it and outlining it. It outlines very nicely. It starts with when we retire at night. Kind of odd that he starts with the end, but my rationalization of that is that he did inventory at night as a preparation for the next day's meditation, and then it goes after retiring at night with inventory. It's a meditation. It's not done in writing. It's done at night out of step 11 on page 86. When we retire at night, we constructively review our day. See, it's not about judgment. It's not about shame and guilt. It's not about destruction. It's constructive. What can we learn from today, and what can we correct for tomorrow? You have already looked at those questions. I'm not going to go over them. The part that really fascinates me and that broke it open for me is upon awakening. He says, on awakening, let us think about the 24 hours ahead. Already, I'm on red alert. My understanding of meditation came out of my monastic experience. I was in a monastery for 7 years. They called what they did meditation. I now know that it's contemplation, not meditation, in the strictest of dictionary definitions. I had also studied Buddhism and the teachers from the East during the time I was attempting to find my way before AA and even after I came in the rooms. And they talked about meditation, which related to my contemplative experience in the monastery, because the practice and method is the same. Contemplation, not meditation. But I didn't know that. So when this dictionary said meditation is directed thinking, and then I said, I see that Bill says on awakening, let us think about the 24 hours ahead. I see that the dictionary and Bill are on the same page. Meditation is about the use of our mind to think. It is not about getting our mind quiet. It is not about silence. It is not about emptiness. It is not about distance from thought. It is not about emptiness. We fill our minds with thought. Let us think about the 24 hours ahead. This is on awakening. We consider our plans for the day a second instruction, but no definition as to what the difference is between thinking about the 24 hours ahead and considering my plans for the day. I'm a big book literalist. I want to know what the words mean. I want to know what Bill meant. I don't know, but I've made up an approach that I'll explain in a minute. But here's the most important part of it. Before we begin, we ask God to direct our thinking. Anytime the book says to talk to God, that's prayer. We ask God to direct our thinking, and this man said, it's a simple prayer, Herb. God, please direct my thinking. See, that's so simple that I almost missed it. He had to explain it a couple times to me. Especially asking, again, prayer, that it be divorced from self-pity, dishonest, or self-seeking motives. Under these conditions, we can employ our mental faculties with assurance. For after all, God gave us brains to use. He's saying our brain has two functions. One of them is to think, to use our mind, to reflect. Our thought life will be placed on a much higher plane when our thinking is cleared of wrong motives. In thinking about our day, we may face indecision during the day. He says, we may not be able to determine which course to take. We're actually thinking about alternatives. Do I turn right or go left? Do I go home and help my family, or I go to the baseball park to watch a game? All decisions. The second part of the function of the brain, my willpower. All of us have had the experience of knowing better, at the same time not doing better. You see, we have the ability to know and to know that we know. That's what makes us human. We're the only sentient being that has that self-reflective capability. It's in our cortex, in the third development of our brain. One function is to know. The other function is to decide. Bill recognizes that in this step. Sought. So this is a very active process of seeking through prayer and meditation. That's the technology, that's the methodology. So I'm reading the step, I'm paraphrasing, I'm commenting on the step itself. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. There's the mission of step 11. That's the purpose of step 11. If you're doing a quiet time, silent time for any other reason, it's wonderful, it's probably helpful. It's just not step 11. There's only one way to do step 11, and that's to intentionally want to improve your conscious contact with God as you understand it, or God as you don't understand it. But listen to how the step ends. It's perfect because it captures us as human beings. Praying, meaning asking again, praying for the knowledge of God's will and the power to do it. Oh my God, there it is. That's who we are as human beings, to know that we know, and we need knowledge. But to do what we do, and we need power. Praying for knowledge of God's will and the power to do it. In thinking about our day, we may face indecision. We may not be able to determine which course to take. Here we ask God. Again, this is a code in the big book. Get used to it. I'll point it out when we see it. It's throughout the book. Bill's and the book's suggestion that we talk to God. He might not say pray, but anytime he asks us to ask God, that's prayer. It's a code as I see it. Here we ask God for inspiration. See, the word itself comes from from the Greek actually. Spiros, S-P-I-R-O-S, which means breath or wind or spirit, spiros. That's the root word of spirit, the breath, the wind, the immaterial, the invisible. We ask for an inspiration, an intuitive thought, That's a function of the mind to be intuitive. Or a decision. We relax and take it easy. We don't struggle. We are often quite surprised how the right answer comes after we have tried this for a while. In most traditions that foster meditation, they call the practice of meditation or prayer or contemplation a practice. We practice, like we practice a piano, like we practice in the gym, like we practice riding a bicycle, like we practice roller skating, like we practice art. And if we have any talent and we have a good teacher and we're consistent in our practice, we develop some competency. What used to be the hunch or the occasional inspiration gradually becomes a working part of the mind. This is a practice. We build grooves of habit, skills of reflection and thinking, and guiding our mind in a direction. The bane of all meditators is distraction. The Buddhists call it the monkey mind. The monkey that swings from tree to tree to tree to get the fruit or the bananas. That's our mind. Our mind's function is to think. Meditation is the discipline to give it handrails so that we have a container and guide our thinking in a direction. In this direction, the intention is to hear God's guidance. Step 11 is about guidance, at least as Bill Wilson understood and wrote about it from the Oxford Group experience. Being still inexperienced and having just made conscious contact with God, it is not probable that we are going to be inspired at all times. We may pay for this presumption in all sorts of absurd actions and ideas. Nevertheless, we find that our thinking will, as time passes, be more and more on the plane of inspiration, on intuition, that practice that makes for progress. We come to rely on it. And then he tells us how to conclude your period of meditation. He never tells us how much time to spend. We usually conclude the period of meditation with a prayer that we be shown all through the day what our next step is to be, that we be given whatever we need to take care of such problems. We ask, again, prayer, especially for freedom from self-will. These are great words, great prayers, and you'll see them in a minute in the script that I wrote in the Way of Life document that some people have found quite helpful. Careful to make no request for ourselves. We may ask for ourselves if others will be helped. We are careful never to pray for our own selfish ends. Many of us have wasted a lot of time doing that, and it doesn't work. You can easily see why. Sometimes we ask our wives or friends or partners to pray with us in a morning meditation. He then talks about a religious connection. He talks about memorizing some prayers that emphasize the principles that we're talking about. And he says, and read the helpful books, please. Hundreds of, thousands, millions of people in search of improved consciousness or the meaning to life have written millions of books over 5,000 to 10,000 years from different traditions and different perspectives. And he talks about the priest, the minister, the rabbi, all inclusive. Be sure to, where religious people are right, make use of what they offer. As we go through the day, we pause when agitated or doubtful. He does connect it to step 10 here. When we're agitated, disturbed, we'll talk about it next week, we ask for the right thought and the right action. Notice the combination of my dealing with my function of my mind to know and my will to make decisions to take voluntary actions. We remind ourselves we are no longer running the show. Now, he uses the theater analogy a lot, especially in step 4. It'll have much more meaning to you once we've completed step 4. But for right now, I'm just pointing out the theater analogy, that his implication is that we play the director in our lives and we run the show. And of course, that doesn't work so well for us nor anybody else. Humbly saying to ourselves many times each day, thy will be done. From my standpoint, that's the most perfect prayer, because I'm using my free will to align my will and my behavior with my understanding of God's will. Thy will be done. I'm looking to be in alignment with, in harmony with my understanding of reality and spiritual principles. We are then much less danger of excitement, fear, anger, worry, self-pity, or foolish decisions. We become more efficient. We do not tire so easily, for we are not burning up energy foolishly as we did when we were trying to arrange life to suit ourselves. It works, it really does. We alcoholics are undisciplined, so we let God discipline us in the simple way we have just outlined. That was the line that brought my step guide to suggest that I outline it, because Bill says here, we have just outlined. Bill just outlined it in the big book. What do we do at night? What we do in the morning? What do we do all day long? That's the outline. But let's go back to page 86 actually. On awakening. I have unpacked or reviewed with you the material in the big book. But here's the key that unlocked the door to meditation in 1988 that allowed me to establish a meditation practice that I've been consistent with for the last 32 years, meaning daily. Of course, I've missed some days. I'll bet you it's not more than 10 days in 32 years in meditating. And even there, I'm not sure that would be right, because I have a consciousness that was a gift to me I've never had before that. But a formal practice of sitting with the intention of receiving guidance and also transformation. I'll talk about that in a minute also. And this is the key. I went over it carefully. It says, before we begin, we ask God to direct our thinking. God, please direct my thinking. Then this man said something that's not in the big book, but it came from his experience to help him understand how to do meditation. We ask God to direct our thinking. God, please direct my thinking. Bill says, then we think about the 24 hours ahead and we consider our plans for the day. This man said to me, we then listen to our thinking as the medium of the message from God. I've never heard God speak to me audibly through my ears. I have heard the tiny whispering sound speak to me all the time in inspiration and intuition, through my heart, through my instincts, through my gut, through some type of an awareness that I can't even put a word on. And over time, I've learned to really trust it, and it's become much more informational and directional. I'm going to say it again. We ask God to direct our thinking. God, please direct my thinking. That's the prayer. Then we begin thinking, listening to the thoughts. That's why we get quiet, not to shut the mind down, but to listen to the mind. What's it saying? Is it just ego chatter? Grocery lists and to-dos? Well, that's not what we're here to do, so we know that's a distraction. And what deeper? What am I to do? Bill gives us two questions. Think about the 24 hours ahead. My definition of that is to take a look, a radar sweep at my day planner. In my imagination, sometimes I actually have my calendar with me if it's a complex day, and I take a look at the day to make sure that, number one, it's in balance, and number two, there's no activity there that I've scheduled and am aware of that's out of line with spiritual principles. My answer to that first question, think about the 24 hours ahead, is about my behavior, about my activity. Well, if that's the case, what's the question that he asks the second time about? Consider your plans for the day. What does he mean by that? I don't know, but I make up a definition for myself so that I can attempt to interpret Bill Wilson's guidance and direction. Consider my plans for the day. If think about the 24 hours ahead, that first question was about what am I going to do, then the second question may be about, and that's my conclusion, who am I going to be today? It goes like this. Yesterday I was unkind. All right, today I'll be kind. Yesterday I was insensitive. Today I'll be sensitive. Yesterday I was very scattered in my thinking and my behavior. Today I will be focused and mindful. I'm going to put words to that. I'm dealing with my character defects du jour because I'm a human being. I never become perfect. None of us will ever become perfect. We can become better human beings, but only if we pay attention to the deficiencies in us from yesterday, learn from them, and then try to correct them today. Consciously correct my behavior. Putting myself back in alignment with God, back in alignment with reality, back in alignment with spiritual principles as I understand it. I mentioned to you that I had been in a monastery, a seminary, training to be a Catholic priest for 7 years, from 1957 to 1964. And it was silent for 7 years, other than the classes. So we did a lot of meditation. We read a lot of books, and I had a lot of teachers, and I had a lot of guidance, and I had a lot of retreats. When I left the monastery, I hung up my black robe, 1964, and I did not meditate again for another 25 years. What's that? I didn't understand what I was doing. I was doing it in the same way I put on the black robe. It came with the territory. I'm a monk, so I put on a black robe and I meditate. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know why to do it. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know the benefit of it. I was well-intentioned, but I wasn't schooled. I wasn't mentored. I'm not blaming anybody. I wasn't ready either. That's very clear. I'm 4 years in Alcoholics Anonymous, 1984 to 1988. I'm going to a meeting every day. I'm calling my sponsor every day. I attempted to work the steps on my own in that first year of recovery, and I did on my own. I got nothing out of it because I didn't know what I was doing, and my sponsor didn't either, and I didn't know that he didn't know. There you go. Blind leading the blind. Oh, yeah. No, it's pandemic. You talk about a pandemic. That's pandemic. And then I heard this man share, and the rest is history. He understood the big book. He understood how to apply the precise instructions to his personal life. And I had the promised spiritual awakening. But now I meditate because it came from the inside, not from the outside, not from my environment, not because it's step 11, not because my sponsor told me so, not because the big book tells me so. I don't do it any of that. I do it because, number one, I know what to do. I know how to do it. I know why to do it. I know the value of it. And I'm very clear. I don't have enough power to live my life or to deal with my addiction. I got very clear with that in steps 1 through 9. I don't have enough power on my own human power to deal effectively with my addiction. I was given the gift of recovery. That was no fault and no work of my own. I'm sure my willingness was part of that gift, as well as my willingness to take action was part of sustaining that gift. But I didn't grow in understanding and effectiveness in those first 4 years. I didn't meditate in those first 4 years. Oh, I prayed because we pray in the group and all of that. And I saw the 3rd step prayer and the 7th step prayer and other prayers in the big book and the 12 and 12. And they're nice prayers. And I go, yeah, it's great, but I didn't resonate with that. Once I did this work and I really had an experience of my powerlessness, and I began to have a bit of an experience with power, then I wanted to improve that power. Bill says in the 12 and 12, as a value proposition, in step 11, you won't do it because it's in the book. You won't do it because your sponsor said so. You won't do it because your meetings say so. You won't do it because it's a good idea. You won't do it because you know how to do it. You'll do it because it has a value to you, at least on a faith basis, until you have some existential experience of the value. And Bill paints it in just graphic terms for us in the 12 and 12. As air, water, sunshine, and food nourishes and sustains the body, prayer and meditation nourishes and sustains the soul, the spirit. Then you have to ask yourself, do you believe it? If you're not doing a morning meditation or meditation sometime during the day, I'm not talking about prayer. I'm not talking about journaling. I'm not talking about reading. I'm not talking about quiet time. If you're not doing meditation, then you actually don't believe that you're powerless, or that there is a power, or that the meditation will give you power. One of those 3 items. Because your behavior tells you, not me, I don't care. Your behavior tells you what you believe. Your feet tell you the truth. Your head and your heart are delusional in many, many cases, especially when it comes to you. But your behavior never lie. How you behave is who you are. How you behave is what you believe. How you behave is what your principles are. Very confrontational. Almost at the ugly level. Wow, what a great litmus test. I want to know the truth about my character and my intentions. Look at how I behave, because that tells me the truth. And you will do that when you do the 4th step, of course. So I began with 5 minutes in 1988. I worked it up to about 15 minutes. I was consistent for a year. And by the end of the year, after a consistent daily practice, I was bored out of my mind with the meditation. I went to several different kinds of people to try to get some help. And the person who ended up being my spiritual director and is today, coincidentally had been a monk himself. His spiritual director was Thomas Merton. If that doesn't impress you, it impresses me. Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk who died in 1968, a prolific writer, probably a mystic and prophet, and in Kentucky, Gethsemane, Kentucky. And this man had been there for 6 years, at about the same time I had been in my monastery. So we had a lot in common. He had a teacher and I didn't. And he got it and I didn't. And he said he didn't know much about the 12-step program. But after I explained my journey of going from steps 1 through 12, as I just had with you, and you already know that I had an experience of addiction and powerlessness, and then went through the 12 steps and had a spiritual awakening, he got it because he was really smart and deeply immersed in the spiritual path. So he really understood what I was talking about when I talked about transformation. And he said, Herb, he said, you're a very task-oriented person. You've read the book, you've highlighted it, you've outlined it, you've written out a script, you have a chair, you have a place, you have a candle, you have a gong, you have the music, you have all the accoutrements, and you sit there, by God, and you're going to be a good meditator. And you, by God, are going to be spiritual. And yeah, no, he was very dramatic. And he said, you have to hear this, Herb. And I hope you can. Because it, again, was the second key to the value proposition and how to do meditation. He said, you're as powerless over your spiritual life as you are over alcohol having no power at all. Think powerless. You are as powerless over your meditation as you are over alcohol having no power at all. Your job is the effort, and the results are none of your business. There's only two mistakes that you can make in meditation. One, not show up. Two, leave early. If you're committing to 1 minute, don't leave before the minute's up. If you're committed to 5 minutes, the timer will tell you when you're done. Not your brain, not your emotions, not your schedule, your timer. He said, get a timer. At that time I worked and I was concerned about getting lost in my meditation and the commute and all the other kinds of things that we think about. So I got a timer and I set it for 5 minutes. And once I got a comfortable level with that, I set it for 10. I got a comfortable level, I set it for 15. I got a comfortable level, I set it for 20. He had suggested a minimum of 20 minutes as a daily practice, but build up to it. Don't try to do it all at once. It's like going to the gym on January 2nd because you're out of shape and you want to be in shape, and you stay there for 3 hours. Well, the next morning you can't get out of bed because you're so sore. So you don't go back to the gym for a week. Well, that doesn't work too well. But if you do 15 minutes and you have a good trainer that coaches you as to how not to hurt yourself, and you go back consistently, maybe not daily in that case, and you have this teacher and you pay attention and you do the exercises, pretty soon you don't need the trainer and you're there by yourself and you're staying for an hour and you feel really good and you begin to really get in shape. We practice, and that's his mantra. All spiritual people have a spiritual practice. There's 4 parts to it. All spiritual people have a spiritual practice, and they practice their practice, and they're faithful to their practice. And then their practice will be faithful to them. It's essentially echoing how Bill writes, especially at the concluding items, how it becomes easier and we live on a plane of intuition and inspiration. Bill doesn't use the term practice, but he implies it. We get better as we consistently make progress. When I was leaving his office, he said, oh, by the way, Herb, if you want to know if your meditation practice is effective, after 3 months of daily practice, ask your wife how you're treating her. Pay attention to how you drive on the freeway. Pay attention to how you treat service personnel in retail restaurants or airlines or stores. Because if in fact your meditation practice is consistent and effective, you will change. You will become a better human being, more sensitive, more considerate, more kind, softer. And that's my experience. We ask God to direct our thinking, then we begin thinking, trusting that that's the medium that God speaks to us through, our thinking. So we listen to our thinking. We hear the phrase, "we small voice," which I used for a long time because it sounded poetic and spiritual and pretty cool. We small voice, as a quote from Scripture. And it's written in books and talked about in meetings a lot like that. But a month or 2 ago, I challenged it in myself. And I went to some original translations And that's not the translation. That's not it's a good, but it's not an accurate translation. The accurate translation is a tiny whispering sound. Very different, subtle. It's a sound, not a voice. It's a sound, not a word. It's tiny whispering, and that's why we get quiet, to listen. What is going on here? How do I determine whether it's my ego talking or the spirit talking? And that's where sponsors and step guides and spiritual directors and therapists and good friends can be quite helpful as sounding boards to help in the beginning, certainly, to distinguish it. Once you do steps 4 and 5, you'll have a much easier way of discerning what's movement of my ego and what's movement of the spirit. Because the steps, especially those steps 4 through 9, deflate the ego and they dismantle the false self. The darkness in us is diminished and eliminated so that the light in us can shine in us, to us, through us, and the light grows as we practice our practice. For next time, I want you to do assignment number 1, item 4. I'm not sure I gave that to you, to look up the word anonymous and write it out. I don't want to take the time with that today, but we might next week. And then assignment 2, items 3, 4, and 5, which is essentially on step 10. And we'll take our time with unpacking my understanding of step 10 next week. And then we will go back to taking a look at the Roman numerals in the textbook from the beginning and unpacking each of those pages. That's one of the longer term assignments described in assignment 2, where you read from the title page up to the doctor's opinion, asking yourself during that time of your reading those 4 questions, and then when you finish the reading, answering those 4 questions. We have probably 2-3 weeks before we get to finishing that work, so there's no rush for you, the reading and or the writing. Yeah, thank you so much, and you've prompted me to say a couple of things. Number 1, of course, the assumption underneath step 11 are steps 2 and 3. So that's a question that I didn't ask you to ask yourself. What is it that you actually believe? Not think, not want, not read, not been told by sponsors or whatever. And I might have alluded a little bit to that. But that's a key. I'm not going to go there right now, because we will when we do steps 2 and 3. But think about that. Is your higher power big enough? Does your higher power care enough? Is your higher power available to you, really? Challenge that as perhaps part of the obstacle for your not doing meditation. So, and then the other thing is, and I'm not going to spend any time on it today, but I can some other time. I mentioned that this is a function of the mind, but there is another practice, and that is the practice from the East and the practice from my monastic background of contemplation, which is a function of the will. The function of my mind is to think and to listen for guidance. The function of my will is to place myself in the presence of God, consenting to have God have God's way with me. It's a contemplative practice. I've incorporated both as what I call intentional consciousness. 2 sides of one coin. One side is my mind, the other side is my will. My mind thinks and my will loves, and that's my spiritual life in a relationship with the mystery. A relationship with the mystery. Because I actually don't know what I'm in relationship with. I've made some decisions about that relationship. And I live as if those decisions are based on fact. But I have no real idea that any of what I think or say or believe is true. When I stand on the path and I look back over my shoulder, I go, you know what? I don't care. My life is working. So I'm going to continue believing what I believe and doing what I do. So that's called faith. And we'll address that when we come to step 2.
Yeah, hi, Herb. You were going over what meditation is, and I realized that I was probably doing more contemplation over the last 10 years. So, of course, I got a little bit nervous. So I need a little clarification.
Oh my gosh, am I doing it wrong?
Right, because I got to do it perfectly.
And the answer is you can't do it wrong.
Okay.
That's very comforting to you perfectionists.
Yes. You said, well, in the big book it says, we ask God to direct our thinking, and then I think you said, then we listen to our thinking. And, when my thinking goes that way, it's like everywhere. It's all over the place. What do I do with that?
Trying to put it, okay, so you may not have had the kind of experience that Australia had and or we have out here with fires. Prairie fires are devastating because they're out of control.
Right.
But I have a heater here and a stove here that provides warmth on the one hand and cooking on the other hand, fire that's contained. Mm. My mind's job is to build a container for its thought process and direct it. God help me to direct it, God direct it, but I'm going to also have a responsibility to direct my thinking. Why am I here in my meditation? When I sit down, the first thing I do in my morning practice is I pray the set-aside prayer. Then I pray the 3rd step prayer, recommitting to be in alignment with my understanding of God. And then I actually say to myself the 11th step, because it tells me why I'm there. I'm not there to become good. I'm not there to become healthy. I'm not there to have better relationships. I'm not there to have grist for the mill I'm an author, so writing my books. That's not the reason I'm there. All of that will come out of it, but those are byproducts. My focus is what the big book says in step 11, to improve my conscious contact with God. In the Way of Life document, the script I referred to is pages 45 to 50. And it has some questions and some protocols and prayers that people found is a good launching pad to either fine-tune their practice or to begin their practice. And you and others might find that helpful. So the image of a fire answers your question directly. A fire on the prairie is horrible. A fire in the stove is very productive. So we build a container for our mind and our thinking, and we direct it. Okay. And that's why I like the term guidance, because that's what I'm listening for. I'm listening for guidance. What do I do and how do I do today? Or even I'm spending the next 2 weeks in a very focused effort. I'll be 80 July 1st. My God, that's officially old. But anyway, how am I going to spend the next 5 years, assuming I live that long? All right, so I'm spending the next 2 weeks in some type of a personal retreat with special meditation on getting some type of an answer to that question. What am I being invited to do and to be in the next 5 years?
I've suffered with obesity my whole life. I think, and me and God think I can take diet pills successfully. I have yet to find, what I do though is I take that thought to my sponsor and to some people that I trust, and I have yet to find any kind of positive endorsement for that plan. So it's really important to me that I don't listen directly to God.
But see, once you do effectively steps 4 through 9, your thinking will be straightened out. And you won't think that way anymore. That's the gift of an awakening.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it, or because I can get pretty crazy with my plans.
It's wonderful that you're that conscious and careful, and then the courage you have to hold yourself transparently accountable and listen to the people who give you that wonderful feedback.
Yeah, I have.
No, that's the secret to success, the willingness for transparency.
Herb, I do have a question for you, which it's been coming up a lot lately. Addiction. Is it self-will? Is it we're born with the allergy? Like a connection to God, or what is it? Where's it come from?
You know, it's a great question. It's probably a scientific question. As I understand, at least in the realm of alcohol addiction, it has to do with a malfunction of the liver, where the liver of 1 out of 10 people malfunctions and produces acetone. And once acetone is in the cellular structure demands more acetone. Now, I'm not a scientist or a chemist. Mm-hmm. I've read the article. I can quote the article from many, many studies. And the conclusion is that alcoholism is hereditary in about 80 or 90% of the cases. I'm white and bald because my father and his father and his father and his father were white and bald. I'm an alcoholic for the same reason. Yeah, I can go back 5 generations and see the alcoholism in the males that I come from. So I don't know the same thing is true for other addictions, but I suspect it is. I believe that the current theory scientifically is that addiction is a malfunction of the brain in terms of dopamine and those kinds of terms that I don't know much about either. But it doesn't matter that we understand exactly its origin. It does matter that we have the symptoms of it. And there's only 2. There's only 2. Everything else is a story about it or the results of it. There's only 2 things that make us an addict. Once we start, we cannot stop. Once we stop, we cannot stay stopped. It's that simple. And we'll see that when we get to step 1.
This goes back to my blockage around the set-aside prayer. God, please set aside everything I think I know about myself, my brokenness, and you. I don't want to know. I am so resistant to changing how I just don't want to change it because I don't trust God. I have huge issues about trusting God. You know, I could run down the list. Most of them are outside of me, which is like, why, you know, fill in the blanks, right? Why is there war in Yemen? Because
of free will and greed.
Why is this world such a mess? Why is there so much suffering?
Because of free will and greed.
You know, so I read step 11 and I think, you know, to improve my conscious contact with God, it's more like to improve my conscious contact with the God that I want to be God.
Bam. Choose that one. Upgrade. You're in for an upgrade.
Well, but that's silliness because I would.
No, it isn't. Wait. No, it isn't. It's just as silly as not believing or believing in what you do believe in.
All right.
The magic of chapter 4, step 2, and I can hardly wait to get there. The magic of chapter 4, step 2, is that Bill insists that you choose your concept.
But my concept has so much conflict with what I see around me.
Get a bigger God, or begin to try to have a bigger perspective that's real and not based on your script of how life should be, because you're not God, goddess.
Because I have this fantasy of the God that I want, but I don't think that's the God that exists. When I,
Make some notes. I'm telling you, I'm inviting you, please. Make some notes about that fantasy. It'll serve you well when you come to step 2.
Okay.
Yep. All right?
All right, thanks.
I'm not encouraging people to think too much about it, because whatever you think right now, you're probably going to have a new experience with step 2, and that's months away from now. So just be gentle with yourself and and listen and open, and that set aside prayer, begin to trust that and this process. You know, she's not unique in the sense that has some sort of negative connection to or resistance to God. And that's what step 2 will be all about, is sort of unpacking what we actually believe and then kind of repacking it so that it's packaged in a way that's useful, because that's really the point. And each one of us will package it uniquely what we need at this time in our development.
I actually read, I read your book a few months before I really found out about you. The book I was reading was Practice in the Here and Now. And actually just today, as I was rereading the one chapter, I was reading about your description of your spiritual advisor talking to you about trying too hard to be good at meditation and what he said to you. And boy, I tell you, it just fit me to a T, Herb. I read that and I thought, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I have done in my program. By the grace of God, Herb, I have had a prayer and meditation practice with the 11th step in the Big Book. I've used that on a daily basis. And what I've done now recently since I've read your book is I have, and I hope this is okay, but I went to Appendix A at the back of that book and I used that outline.
Is, I believe, the same outline that you have in the Way of Life document, pages 45 to 50. But there might be a difference, but essentially that's the outline. Thanks for the confirmation. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But,
no, that's fine.
But when
Herb,
you make a great commercial like that, I've got to support it.
Yeah, well, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate that, Herb, because it really put the meat into the time that I had been spending for years, And
What word is a problem for you?
Well, it's just that responsive, and you're not God. And I get it. It's got nothing to do with humility, because I've been so humbled in this beautiful recovery, and I am not in charge of the universe, and I'm not in control of anything. And so, I get that, but there's a way in which my meditation has really given me a gift of saying I'm totally cut from that cloth, and I'm a part of this. I just get curious if you have any sort of just general response to that, because I feel a deep alignment, not just alignment with God, but I'm a spark of that. I'm a manifestation of it. So does that make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense, actually. I have meditated on and written lots of large reflections about that kind of unity that is at the core of reality. And when we talk about God, a lot of times people will respond to the fish in the water. The fish doesn't know it's in water, but it's totally dependent on the water for survival. And some people like that, is I'm surrounded by God and God is the source of my life. It's nice. It's still very dualistic, though. Right. Along the line that I think you're thinking, I like the wave in the ocean concept. So the wave comes out of the ocean, and it might be a tsunami that's 100 feet high and it lasts for 3 days. The wave is not the ocean, but the wave is not the ocean. And it has a time and space, and then it recedes and becomes one with the ocean again. And I think you get the symbolism of that answers your question, because that's my thought about God and me. I am not God, but God has manifested as Herb.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. That's exactly. I got the book 12 Steps to Spiritual Awakening, your book, which I'm really enjoying, but I didn't know, because it's not a required book. I think you strongly recommend it, but it's great. And I just was curious, are there any times along this journey where you actually reference that? Oh, okay. Okay, so it's just other
than saying in the assignments, I did put required, and in my comments, I softened it by saying strongly suggested.
Oh, yes.
And the reasons are, it's really helpful, but no, I don't refer to, the only book I refer to is the Big Book, and then the 12 and 12 as supplement. I don't even require the supplement, and we don't study the 12 and 12 here. I'll make comments about it because there are things in there, like next week, I will unpack step 10 from the 12 and 12 as a complement supplement to the work in the big book, because it really clarifies the use of the tool of the 10th step. Whereas the big book gives us the formula, it doesn't really talk as clearly about the application as does step 10 in the 12 and 12.
Beautiful. Thank you,
Yeah.
sir.
Great question.
You know, last week you talked so much about powerlessness. And today you were like, power, yeah, it's the lack of my dilemma, but God is my power, hence pray and meditate. And about 26 years sober, something really drastic happened to me. And I just stopped. And it makes me want to cry. It's like, thank you for reminding me. Like, thank God I didn't drink or use. Thank God there's this grace that blankets my life. And now I'm back in. And it just gives me goosebumps because I believe it was you that said this, maybe not, that I didn't get sober to rely upon the group. The journey was to find God of my understanding. And I've never had that type of permission in my whole life.
And the Buddhists have a great symbol for that. And they talk about the master that stands on the path that the master walked to get transformation. And the master has a group of students, disciples, and the master points the way to the light. Many of the students begin worshiping the finger instead of going for the light. This is not about meetings. This is not about AA. This is not even about the steps. This is about finding God. This is about finding power. This is about having a relationship with the light.
Yeah, I heard it this time. It's taken 3 times, but I'm like in awe. I don't even know what to say. I hear you this time.
Several of the people mentioned centering prayer. That's a contemplative practice. That's the other half of my step 11 that's not in the big book, but that is my extension of and expansion of my practice.
My question is this. I do an hour per day of contemplation and prayer. And I do a general daily examine, an Ignatian daily examine at night. Now, how do you suggest I incorporate meditation into that?
No, it's a wonderful question. I basically compartmentalize and define 3 major parts of what I call intentional consciousness: prayer, meditation, and contemplation. Over the years, I've incorporated all 3 parts of that into my daily practice as simply as I can, and then we can get more complicated if necessary. My understanding of prayer and meditation actually came out of AA. In the meetings, I heard prayer is talking to God, meditation is listening to God. Now I heard it, I mouthed it, but I didn't understand what that meant, the meditation, until I did the steps with a man who did understand what it meant. And it was listening to my thinking based on the big book's specific direction. Upon awakening, we ask God to direct our thinking. And also cooperated by the Webster's Dictionary that said meditation is directed thinking. It was a year later that I was exposed to a monk who explained what he called centering prayer, but it comes under the broad umbrella of the contemplative practice, which I had experimented with earlier on when I was in a monastery as a monk, and I had experimented with in my journey in trying to understand and practice a little bit of Buddhism. Neither of which experience, the monastery or Buddhism, gave me actually any understanding of what I was doing. But Father Thomas Keating did. And so I'm going to come back now and say, Prayer is when I'm talking to God. Meditation is when I'm listening to God for guidance, and I'm listening to my mind and all my awareness, an active process. And then my contemplative component is when I'm just plain sitting in the presence of God with an open heart, consenting with my will, with my free will, consenting, thy will be done, consenting, have your way with me, consenting, please transform me in the way that you determine, not the way that I'm even conscious of or aware of, or inviting you to. I'm inviting with an open mind and an open heart to be transformed by your presence in your presence.
Do you do prayer first, meditate first, contemplate? What's the order?
Yes, that's the order that I start out with as a structure. Yes, I start with prayer, then I go into meditation, and then I evolve into contemplation. But during that time, excellent question, just excellent. During the time, let's assume I'm committed to a 30-minute sit that morning, and during that time, it is kind of a spiral dynamic. Like, I get into my practice, and then all of a sudden I find myself thinking. Now, that's an interruption to the contemplative practice, but if it's something that's feeding me, I go with it. I'm very open. I wear it like a loose garment. Not undisciplined. I still have the container of what my purpose is. So I'm very aware of my purpose in all three of the components, but I allow the Spirit to move me in it and through it.
You had mentioned that you were trained in transcendental meditation. I'm wondering how that would fit into with what we're talking about here, as far as...
Well, it's been, it's great. It's been 45 or 50 years since I was exposed to transcendental meditation. But that was the memory that I had. It's a human development exercise. And as such, it will be biologically healthy. It will produce psychological harmony. It will produce better relationships in terms of sociology. Everything that you just said. The practice that you have is a quieting, settling, allowing yourself to become conscious of your consciousness through the use of a repetitive word they call mantra, so that in fact you can sort of allow the chatter to slip away as you become aware that there's chatter. And so you're aware of your consciousness. That's all wonderful. And as you said, you could read several books on all of those benefits, biology, psychology, and sociology. Absolutely. It's just not theology. Not once did you mention higher power or God as we don't understand it, in terms of the reason that you do it and your experience with it. So all it takes now is the vision of and motivation for some type of a relationship with Spirit. And then you don't have to change anything because you've reframed it. Did you hear that transition? It's so gentle, it's so subtle, but it is different though, because it's talking about what is your motivation, coming from the Latin word movere, what moves us. And what moves me in step 11 originally was to get guidance. Then when I met a man who explained the contemplative practice to me in a way that I could understand it and then do it, then I understood it as a spiritual transformational process. So then I added all of that together. That's what I want, what you said, biological, health. I want psychological, emotional sobriety and harmony and maturity. I want better relationships, especially in my family, but also with everybody else. And I'll get that as a byproduct of the function, but my only purpose as a priority focus for doing meditation as I call meditation. I'm going to change the word because I don't want to confuse it. For doing my morning practice, the primary motivation for me is to have a relationship with spirit. Everything else will come and has come. Great question. Now, I hope in an effort to answer your question and you answering mine, because you confirmed my suspicion about transcendental meditation. It's a wonderful, healthy practice. All right. And it incorporates, probably prepares you for that slight little adjustment so that you can, in fact, make it an effective step 11 practice.
Great, thank you.
In fact, and you'll hear it next week when we look at step 10. I call step 10 emotional sobriety. That's the tool, step 10, for emotional sobriety. And steps 11 and 12 are the two cornerstones of spiritual sobriety, the coin. So you'll hear that next week. But I wanted to put that in also in the context of this conversation.
I got a couple of things. It's off the topic of meditation, but it's really pressing from page 13. I don't know if it's disturbances or frustrations, but there's a couple of patterns in my life. And the first one is, but I'll go into this fear of failure and that I'm going to not be successful. It blocks me from the Spirit of God. You know, I've heard somebody saying, it might have been you, if you don't work on it, it's not going to change. Well, I don't know if it's something later on in the step work. I just needed to talk about it.
Well, I'm glad you did. And just from an objective standpoint, it sounds like you have a long exposure in your work and career to doing this work, and you've done it successfully, right?
Yes, sir.
So the fear is baseless. It's not based on any type of reality of your incompetence or your past experience of being embarrassed by failure.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
Yes. It's just something.
So no, I understand what fear is.
Okay.
It's not rational. It's an emotion. That's right. And to answer one part of your question, the step 4 inventory has 3 parts: anger, fear, and dishonesty. As I calibrate it, the actual terminology is used in the big book is resentment and fear and sex. Those are the 3 sections as Bill included the words. I use anger and fear and dishonesty because they represent the words that reflect what he says, what Bill says in the 12 and 12 in step 4, instincts, basic instincts gone awry. And from my studies in biology and psychology, I know that as animals, our basic survival instincts are fight, flight, and freeze. Now, giving that background, which may not make any difference at all to you, there is a section in the big book, then in step 4, that talks about fear, page 68. And it says a little bit like what you said there in terms of faith, but it talks about fear and self-reliance, trust in God reliance. And my understanding of fear is that there are only 2 natural fears that come from our very nature. One is the fear of loud noises, and the other is the fear of falling. So the fear you're experiencing is an acquired fear. The good news is if you acquired it, and you have some speculation as to why you might have it, and those are valid, it's just fine. But the good news is if you acquired it, you can, what the psychologists call extinguish it, meaning get rid of it. And the big book gives us a couple suggestions. Number 1, it says, you make a list of your fears, and then you ask, why do I have it? The man who took me through the steps then reinterpreted that by saying, and then continue to ask the question of the answer that you put down. So if I have a fear of failure because I'll get fired, you ask yourself the question, well, what is my fear that comes up if I get fired? Well, I won't have any income. Well, what is the fear that comes up if that's true? You hear I'm unpacking my fear by going deeper each time with the question, and pretty soon you come down to some area of an answer for yourself that might be psychological or it might be theological, but you'll just come to some answer. After all that's done, Bill says in the big book there on page 68, if all else fails, my terms, if all else fails, pray, because in fact you're powerless to get rid of your fears. You can analyze them, you can understand them, you can talk about them as you have and are doing, but that won't necessarily get rid of or even diminish the fear. My experience is then I pray specifically for the removal of this fear, and I continue to lean into the reality of my job. At the same time, I'm experiencing the fear that has been somewhat disabling. That's a lot. Did it help?
Yes, yes. And I've got a lot of, I've got some work to do.
Yeah,
One more thing real quick. Have you ever known of somebody that I've been married for 30 years, got a loving wife, beautiful family. I've got an ex-wife, been divorced for 35 years, that hurt me as much as I've ever been hurt before.
Your ex-wife?
Yes, and anybody else would just let it go and not have anything to do, or not had anything to do, but it's still, this person pops in my head. It's like an addiction, but
the hurt?
Not hurt, just it's kind of mental obsession.
Well, you're taking us in some directions that we will eventually come in and do a deep dive in. But I want to touch on this. It's such an important issue. I mean, there's so many people on this call right now that are resonating with what you're talking about, that what I'm saying to you is helping a lot of people. There's a book that I have begun saying is the second most important book I've ever read in my entire life. The first book, of course, you might suspect is the big book, because the big book is a textbook that gave me what I was looking for, what was a practical methodology for transformation. And I had, as I say, studied to be a priest, studied to be a psychologist, studied all the human development kind, and I did not change. So that's why I have such reverence for, and it has such a place in my priorities, the big book. But probably 20 years ago, I was introduced to a book on forgiveness. And I looked up the term forgiveness in the dictionary. Watch my hand. Forgiveness is a decision to release them. Yeah, does that resonate? Exactly. And the prayer of St. Francis says, to the extent that we release them, we're released. And the Lord's Prayer says, to the extent that we forgive them their debts, our debts are forgiven. It's one of those spiritual paradoxes. The name of the book is Forgive for Good by Fred Luskin. He's a clinical psychologist at Stanford, a professor there of psychology. And he wrote this book originally as his doctoral thesis 30 years ago on forgiveness, and then converted it 25 years ago to a book that we could read as lay people. And once I had done the steps, especially 4 through 9, I realized that steps 4 through 9 is the process of forgiveness from a spiritual standpoint. Fred Luskin writes the process, a total parallel with different vocabulary process, a total parallel process from a psychological standpoint. We've done some work together, and he has acknowledged that we have a benefit. The words are different, but the process is the same. I said to him, he says, yeah, but you guys in the spiritual world, in the 12-step world, have a tremendous advantage. And I said, Fred, what's that? He said, you got God. You've got a higher power. He said, I can't use that. I'm a scientist. I can't use that. But it is the powerful X component that brings it over the top for the people who experiment with it. Does that help?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I guess the sponsor that I had in OA to take me through the 12 steps, she sponsors a lot of people. She's married, she has kids, she's busy, has a job, and she doesn't keep on with people. You know, she turns it over and starts working with new people and sets you free to sponsor other people. How can someone continue to sponsor new people and have them sort of stack up, you know, like maybe over several years, maybe you've sponsored 30 people and you can't continuously be in touch with
it depends on what you mean by sponsorship. And in one sense, it does stack up if in fact you start sponsoring people, helping them, they get some traction, and then they don't need as much help, and then you go on to other people, which is absolutely wonderful, which was my experience. And I went to my step guide. I've only had 2 sponsors, but I've helped a lot of people. And I went to my step guide and I said, essentially what you said. And he said, I only handle 1 person at a time. So I never look at the multiples. I just deal with 1 person at a time. If God sends them, I don't send them away. Then I talked to another man about that, and he said, I sit down with my family once a month or once a year, depending on the situation, and I go over calendars in terms of what are the family events and what are my obligations and responsibilities, and we work out our calendar, and in all the white spaces, AA owns me. So I've never had a problem with that. But I deal with 1 person at a time. I'm asked all the time, how many people do you sponsor? I literally don't know. I don't keep track of how many. I have their phone numbers, all right, but I never go and count them. It's not important to me. In fact, it's important for me not to know, because otherwise it becomes then an ego chore. You need to determine in your own prayer and meditation what it is that you can handle so that you can maintain balance in your life. Because helping other people can be a black hole, bottomless pit. The way I sponsor is I give suggestions. If they take my suggestions, there will be outcomes and results. If they don't take my suggestions, there will be outcomes and results. They have the dignity of choosing whether they want to take my suggestions or not, and having the results and consequences that come from either taking it or not taking it. I'm not responsible for their sobriety, and I'm not responsible for their death. And I'm not attached to either one. I just want to help. Now, if you want to read a book, anybody, on sponsorship, the one that I recommend, I've read it 3 times, is from Hazelton. It's called 12-Step Sponsorship by Hamilton B. And it's just, well, I consider it the best book on sponsorship I've come across. There may be others, but it's the only one that I recommend.
Okay.
My question has to do with different types of meditation. What do you think about guided meditation or meditating with like ethereal music in the background?
I'm really practical. Does it help? If it helps, continue it. If it doesn't help, don't do it. My own spiritual director was very clear in many of our conversations that some people can't sit and meditate, but they can walk and meditate. I sponsor guys who run and meditate. I sponsor a guy who surfs and meditate. My spiritual director suggested that there are people that knit and crochet, and that's part of an ability then to allow them to go into a wonderful deep meditation. Some people garden, some people groom their dogs. Yeah. So the point was, be real practical. What works to support you? Then I'll come back to another question, which is my favorite question anytime we have a conversation about meditation, and that is, why are you doing meditation? And as long as you're really aware of why you're doing your meditation, then anything that will support that focus is a benefit. I don't use music. It's a distraction. I'll use music to put me in a mood to sit quietly if I am feeling not quiet. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that at least I think I understand about yoga is that yoga was a physical exercise that was originated to prepare somebody for meditation.
Okay, well, thank you.
Well, and that reminded me that my spiritual director talks about walking meditation, literally not walking like I do. I walk every day for an hour, and that's not my meditation time, but it is sometimes very relaxing. He talks about a walking meditation where you're literally very slowly moving your feet forward. I mean, like a caterpillar going forward, and you're doing it maybe in a garden or in some private place where there is the motion, but it's not any type of physical exercise. It's just the motion where you're allowing yourself to be quite self-conscious, if you will, or conscious of your consciousness.
Do you have any advice on antidepressants and taking and connecting with my higher power?
Well, first of all, connect with your psychologist. Not your doctor, not your medical doctor. And if you're in a 12-step program, my preference would be not a psychiatrist.
Oh, okay.
A psychiatrist is trained as a medical doctor and then advanced training as a psychoanalytic therapist through essentially from the Freud lineage. I don't have any problem with that on the surface, all right? But the psychiatrists, at least here I'm familiar with in California, write too many prescriptions. The easier, softer way to deal with problems. I'd much rather, if you're looking for a therapeutic evaluation and process, for you to use a psychologist, and my personal preference is a PhD clinical psychologist. And there's lots of other qualified people to do therapy. That's just my personal preference. And a psychologist cannot write a script for prescriptions. I'm 100% totally supportive of antidepressant medication where there's clinical depression. Okay. And a medical doctor, psychiatrist, is the one to be able to evaluate that. A psychologist can also do that. My wife is a good example of that. She had what was determined to be clinical depression because of her sobriety. She got sober first, started the journey. She heard in the rooms that if you're on any kind of medication like that, you're not sober. And that you need to be very, very circumspect about using any type of mind-altering drugs, medication. So given the little South Chicago Irish lady that she is, she said, I'm not going to take any medication. Well, she suffered her depression for a long time until the suffering got so bad that she, in fact, began taking the medication. And within a month or two, it takes that long to kind of get your, get for it to work in your system. She began to really feel, and after a year, she really, wow, I'm on level ground now. I think I can go off my medication. And she did, and she went back into the toilet. And after about 6 months of suffering, she went back on the medication because she was clinically depressed. It was a biological deficiency, and she needed to have that chemical balance. Lots of people are able to solve their depression by doing the steps, but it's not clinical depression. It's some emotional kind of disturbance that creates a depression of frustration. But a clinical depression comes from the biology. Now, I am not a psychologist. I am not a doctor. I am not a physician. I am not a pharmacist. So I'm just sharing you some experience that I've had in dealing with this with the professionals. I have no opinion on medication other than I can see where it helps. But it's not a replacement for the steps. And the steps will never be a replacement for medication. My sense is, I might be wrong, but my sense is you have a hard time accepting reality because it's not going according to your script. You have some belief that you shouldn't suffer. You have some belief that this disease shouldn't be this disease. My sense is that you're not accepting the reality of your reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true at some level. I think part of it too, Herb, is I don't trust myself. I mean, my sponsor keeps saying, Kristen, you're doing so great. You're doing so well. Yep. And I mean, and I think it always gets back to there's this part of me that is always said, no matter what I do, it's wrong. And I mean, maybe that's when I brought it up from the very beginning, is it's like, and that's what I've been working in 6 and 7 is like, please release these thoughts in my head that it's wrong, that I'm wrong. And, you know, to just really work on affirming that I'm okay no matter what, you know, that I am doing okay. And I'm doing service and I'm sponsoring and I'm, you know, I'm doing a lot of things, but it's just that internal voice sometimes. It's like, you know, where does this come from and why can't, that's the compulsive voice, not only with the food and the illness, but there's this compulsive voice that says you're doing it wrong. And maybe that's the one I guess I just need to keep turning over. You know?
And maybe get some additional information on healthy self-esteem and positive thinking. Yeah. Nathaniel Brandon is a clinical psychologist who's written many, many books on self-esteem. And you could Google one of those and take a look at, so what would it mean if you didn't have all of this negativity that, in fact, you've been talking about?
Right.
Because negativity, it's a poison in our system.
Well, sure. Yeah. And I guess I'm just becoming more and more aware of it. That is the underlying story in my brain. Even with all this recovery and all this stuff that everyone else sees, but there's still that belief that somehow I'm doing it wrong or it's not enough. You know, what's enough?
All right, good. So let's bring our formal session together to a conclusion with that serenity prayer. As I've mentioned many times in my approach to the serenity prayer, it's a prayer about reality. It's a prayer about our harmony and our humility. What can I influence? What can't I influence? I need wisdom to discern that. Reality is immutable and non-negotiable. It's just what it is. It's not right or wrong. It's not healthy or unhealthy. It's not fair or unfair. Reality just is. And it's the work of this work that we'll do here to become quite conscious of what we can and cannot influence, and then what we're responsible to let go and to accept responsibility for. Please join me in serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.